The Bible is a holy book, and there's a lot of interesting people in it. As Christians, we tend to study the Bible to understand God and to work on our spiritual disciplines. And look, we're not in church right now. You saw the title. It was something like CHADS in the Bible tier list. I figured it'd be fun to talk about all the manly men in the Bible and the less manly men in the Bible from the perspective of how Chad they are. So let's go. Let's start out from the top with Jesus. Jesus goes in Jesus tier. It's way up there, if you can even see it. Also, I'm not really going to talk about it. He's Jesus, he's God and man in one. Of course, he's the most Chad. So let's get to the interesting part of the video. So hopefully I satisfied enough of the uptight people and we can just get started with the rest of the list. So let's go with one of the big time boys. My guy, David. David was a real one. Like a real one. If we just took the story of David and Goliath, we'd probably already be up in B tier. I mean, the whole situation was tough. Everybody in Israel was all scared, but David stood on business. He was not about to let some heathens talk crazy about God. So David agrees to go fight Goliath. They decide to give David the king's armor. He tried it on and then said, nah, I'm gonna do my own thing. He walked up and one-shot Goliath with a sling. One tap. But that is not all we have for David. Off screen, we hear that David killed a lion and that he killed a bear. And then in the Bible, we have things like how he won his first wife, which actually, we're not going to go into that one today. And he became king in the coldest way possible. The man dropped bar after bar. And the women loved him. And even in the Psalms, where he was praying to God, he still sounded tough. Like, just to paraphrase something that he said in Psalms, as wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. Now, David did not live a perfect life. We know about the whole Bathsheba thing with the whole rubber ducky and all that. But this is not a righteousness tier list. This is a Chad tier list. And David did a lot of Chad things. I wish I had time to go into all of them, but David is easy S tier. Definitely up there. Now, this is not an OT only list. We got to get some New Testament boys in there too. They got to be judged a little differently. I mean, this list is all kind of vibes, but the New Testament boys have different vibes. We got Peter. Now, look. Peter is way overhated. For example, he gets called out for failing to walk across the water, but come here. Let me ask you a question. How much water can you walk on? And what about the other disciples? Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought. Peter was super real for stepping out on the water in the first place. He also gets called out a lot for being corrected all the time by Jesus. People are like, oh, Peter, you're so relatable. No. You should probably relate a little better to the other 11 disciples who sat over there and let Peter ask all the questions and take all the heat. Peter was not afraid to look dumb. He was a Chad. Oh, well, what about Peter denying Jesus 3 times? Okay, that was bad. I'm not going to lie to you. Not good. But Jesus had grace for him, so I'm willing to as well. And he also showed that he was willing to stand on business before that. When the high priest men showed up to capture Jesus, Peter pulled out his sword and got to work. He was not about to let Jesus go for free. Peter messed up sometimes, but a lot less than people like to make it out to be. He just has like a microscope on his life. You really can't ask for much more from a New Testament guy in terms of chadness. The man did what he was supposed to do without complaining. He was persecuted, and then he was martyred. S tier Chad, easily. We stand Peter over here. Okay, honestly, forget that. We can cut that line. If you're enjoying the video so far, you must subscribe to see more content about this. All right, so we got to get some stinkers in here, or else we can't really appreciate the people up at the top of the list. Old Testament Saul was a stinker. This man was the polar opposite of a Chad. All right, let's do a little recap for Saul. Samuel, the prophet, goes out to pick the first king of Israel, and God chooses Saul. Cool. Samuel goes to Saul and anoints him to be king in private. Cool. So after this, Samuel goes in front of all Israel and does this whole ceremony to show off who's gonna be the new king. And wouldn't you know it, Saul is nowhere to be found. Turns out Saul was hiding with the luggage, which is double crazy because the Bible specifically calls out that Saul was taller than everyone else around and that he stuck out. So you got this tall, handsome man who's specifically told that he's gonna be king, and his reaction is to go and try to hide in the luggage like this is a Tom and Jerry cartoon or something. Like, what are you doing? What is good with you? Saul fumbled constantly as king. Now, it's one thing to fumble. David fumbled, big time, twice. But when David fumbled, he repented and went and asked for forgiveness from God. AKA David took his licks. Saul was always coy about it, trying to find some reason why it's not his fault that he broke the law. Then, when Saul felt like his throne was threatened by David, who was super loyal, by the way, Saul decided to try to have David killed. Okay, that would be bad enough. But then when David checked him, Saul backed down and was like, oh yeah, I wasn't trying to kill you. We're cool. And this happened twice. He was a straight up punk. And he kind of died like a punk too, not gonna lie. Man's got hurt in a battle, and then he has his own shield bearer kill him just so he doesn't have to go out to the ops. Bro. Saul was weak. Easy F tier. Get him out of here. All right, let's go to Moses. Moses has a ton of the Bible written about him. He has a lot of righteousness feats, but he's not really talked about very much as a Chad. I mean, to be fair, you don't really talk about any of these people in the Bible as Chads, but hey, we're changing that. Moses has a lot more Chad moments than you might think about. Remember the time back when Moses was like the Prince of Egypt, like the movie and all that? He saw one of his brothers being abused by an Egyptian. You know what he did? You know, he called the police and asked for help. No, he stepped in and eliminated him. Now, the Bible doesn't even say how. It does say that the other Israelites were afraid of Moses from what he did, which just goes to show Moses was cold. Also, he was willing to stand on business. He also showed off Chad behavior when he had the whole situation with Korah. Okay, not that Korah, although I also don't really like her. The Bible Korah. Korah talked crazy about Moses and said that Moses shouldn't be leading Israel. Moses stood 10 toes down and said that he was the one that God chose. Then Korah and all his people got eaten up by the ground. Wouldn't you know it? And Moses also stood 10 toes down over and over again against Pharaoh. Again, Prince of Egypt. Remember the part with the playing with the big boys now? Yeah, Moses was not afraid. So all these things will make you think that Moses is really about the smoke. And he was. But he does have one major point against him. He initially refused to speak for God because he was afraid of his stutter, which that was kind of weak. Loses him some points. But he does win some of those points back with how he rizzed up his wife in the first place. If you don't know that story, look it up. It was tough. I think I have to put Moses in A. Like, it's close to S, but I think he has to end up in A. All right, time for another New Testament guy. We got Stephen. Now, Stephen isn't in the Bible for very long. He shows up, does some stuff, and the next chapter he's stoned. But while he was there, he did go hard in the paint. Sorry, that now I feel old just saying that. Well, when he was here, he was tough. Stephen was stated to be one of the first deacons. Translation, he took care of the widows and the fatherless professionally. And that's pretty Chad. They also say he preached with power and did miracles. Solid resume so far. But where he really gets his points is for how he stood up in front of the Jews. They say they couldn't beat his arguments, so they got the crowd angry and threw him in front of the council. Does that sound familiar? Now from here, Stephen probably could have made some solid arguments and fought back, and he might have made it out just fine. But instead, he popped off. My man pulled from the Old Testament to show that Jesus really was the Messiah, and then he directly accused the council for killing him. Stephen was locked in. He did not have a fearful bone in his body. And then he completed it all with his dying words, which honestly, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This man was that guy. Stephen, A tier. He showed up, flexed on everyone, became the first martyr. Real. All right, James and John. Now, you gotta love James and John, but they don't have like a huge resume as Chads. Their nickname gets them on the list just by itself. They're called the Sons of Thunder. Come on, man, that's hard all by itself. They do have a few feats between them. Honestly, it was pretty bold of them to ask Jesus to sit on his right and on his left in glory. Pretty confident. Honestly, the move is kind of giving Peter, but shout out to them. At least John, though, was pretty self-confident as well. Shout out to giving yourself the nickname, the disciple who Jesus loved. John was also the only disciple to go with Peter into the courtyard when Jesus got captured, so big ups to him for that, too. Both James and John are super solid apostles, but they don't have a lot of feats, so they're going to have to go into, below B tier, just because we don't have a lot to go on. All right, Jacob. Jacob might be the hardest one for me to rank on this list. So Jacob is twins with Esau, and Esau is introduced, honestly, as a Giga Chad. They say Esau was a cunning hunter and a man of the field. Nice. They introduced Jacob as being a plain man, and that he dwelled in tents. That doesn't sound super Giga Chad. Also, Jacob stealing Esau's birthright and his blessing was pretty shrewd. It was God's intention. But the way he'd been about it wasn't really like Chad. It was just, it just wasn't very Chad. To be honest, Jacob also came off as just a little bit of a simp when it came to Rachel. To be fair, Lamech did him dirty. Lamech would be an F tier in the Chad tier list. And if there was a not being a hoe tier list, Lamech would also be an F on that one too. But Leah turned out to be a pretty good wife. I'm sorry. What he did with Rachel is giving simp. So all this sounds like we're trending towards Jacob being in the C or F tier. But he also wrestled with God. For an angel, honestly, we're not going to get into that today. At God or an angel, still pretty tough. That's huge Chad energy right there. He had aura. I won't let you go until you give me my blessing. Woo! That line was tough. It makes me want to hit the gym, honestly. So Jacob's in a weird place where he has like this one S-tier Chad feat and a bunch of not very Chad feats. But his one feat is really good. I think I'm going to have to put him in C after all that, just because, you know, one feat's not enough to put you up into the B tier. Who knows, though? Maybe we'll slide him around at the end. POV, he did not slide them around at the end. We got Samson. Samson is the definition of a Giga Chad for most of the story. The man soloed a lion with his bare hands. And then there was like honey in the lion. I honestly still don't get that story. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted. There was also a time where he wanted to light his enemies' fields on fire. So you know what he did? He captured a bunch of foxes, then tied firebrands to their tails, then had them run through the fields and light them up. I mean, the idea was really smart and really cool, but just catching all the foxes by itself is a pretty Chad thing as well. Shout out Samson. This man was him. Now, Samson does have one really big flaw. He simped so hard that he died. And the whole thing with Delilah was just like, bro, what's going on? Delilah betraying him over and over again, and then he just kind of doesn't care up until the point when he does lose his power. She must have been like bad, because if this is Samson, he probably could have had any woman that he wanted. Samson did go out looking pretty cold, though. Blind and tied up, and he still brought down the whole building and killed his enemies. This man was a different animal. Samson is proof that God could just have superheroes running around at any point that he wanted, but he just chooses not to. I mean, can we go back to the part where Samson soloed 1,000 men with the donkey's jaw? 1,000 men? I mean, that would be impressive if he had a gun or something. With a donkey's jawbone, this man was Doom Guy in real life. Samson's going to have to go into A tier. I really wish I could put him in S tier, but again, with Delilah and the brother. All right, Solomon. Solomon's another hard one. On one hand, he kind of nailed the peacetime Giga Chad. He didn't have hundreds of Philistines to kill like David did, but he did come to power like a gangster, and by that I mean like the Sopranos style. A bunch of people messed up while David was king, but David couldn't kill him for one reason or another. When Solomon became king, he cleaned up house. He didn't let anybody cause any problems with his ascension either. And his whole request for wisdom from God was pretty cold, and leads to one of the coldest scenes in the Bible. You know, the one with with cutting the baby in half? Like, how did a human come up with that solution? Timothy. That man was straight up him. He had people bringing caravans of money just to talk to him. And then he hard through with his wives. I mean, come on, dog. 700 wives leading you away from God? I think most dudes would cap out around 100. 700? Brother. I think ultimately Solomon ends up around B tier. Like, he could be one tier higher or lower, so I'm just going to take the average, B. All right, Jonah. Jonah. I think Jonah might be a touch overhated too, but he wasn't really much of a Chad. Running away from what God told you to do is not Chad behavior. It's honestly kind of hoe behavior. He does redeem himself in a moral sense with his prayer in the belly of the fish, but it wasn't like super Chad either. Jonah's saving grace on this tier list is that he was that guy when it came to preaching. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, not because he was worried the Ninevites wouldn't listen to him. No. He didn't want to go because he knew that if he preached to them, they would repent. He was that cold. And still, he loses most of the points that he won in preaching with the whole situation with the gourd. I mean, it's one of the weirdest chapters in the Bible. He wishes that he wishes to die because it was hot outside and his gourd dried up, so he didn't have any shade. Jonah gets low C tier. He honestly wasn't that bad of a guy, but he was not a Chad. David's mighty men. I decided to throw David's mighty men together into one group because I didn't want them to just clog up the whole list. I mean, you can make whole videos about how David's mighty men were those guys. Even the minor ones still kind of popped off. So I'm just going to highlight some feats from individual men. Shout out to Benaniah. They say that Benaniah killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. And if that doesn't sound like it deserves an edit, I mean, you're probably not a man. I'm not going to lie to you. And Benaniah didn't even make the top 4. Then you have the 3. You got Jashibium, however you say his name. You know, he soloed 300 guys with a spear, just as you do. And you got Abishai, who did the same thing. Because, you know, I mean, I guess if you're part of the 3, that's just kind of how you roll. Together, the 3 broke into a city by themselves, fought their way in, grabbed some water out of a well and fought their way back out just because David was thirsty. Come on, man. They were like real-life video game characters. Then you got Joab, who... Joab was a little rough character-wise. He had a thing for just murdering good men.
3 counts of attempted murder. 2 counts of capital murder.
But as far as being a Chad goes, he was pretty Chad, to be honest. I mean, there are 30 dudes in David's Mighty Men, so I don't want to clog up the whole list. But these guys go to S tier. Come on. They were tough. We need a David's Mighty Men anime. Get on it, somebody. All right, we need some more New Testament representation. Let's go with Paul. I mean, he did write most of the New Testament. So pre-Christ Paul, Saul, let's just call him Saul to keep it simple. Saul was not a good dude. He was actually kind of high-tier evil. He considered himself chief among sinners. And he was party to our guy Stephen's death. It's not cool. That being said, this is not a righteousness tier list, so these things aren't necessarily anti-Chad, they're just anti-God. You know, Paul post-Christ had massive Chad energy. I mean, that man was fearless. Remember the time when Paul went into that one town and preached, and then they stoned him to death? And then he was dragged outside, and God revived him. After that, he decided, to go right back into the same town and preach again. He was not afraid of any man. Paul had ice in his veins. Certified him energy. Remember also the time when they got shipwrecked, completely kept his cool, then he got bit by a snake, and he was just like, yeah, it's fine. Even him going to Rome came from him standing on business. He was willing to stand up for the principle of the thing. Paul was even Chad when it came to preaching. I mean, he founded churches, but he wouldn't let them take care of him. Instead, he took care of himself by making tents, which is a nice outdoor job. He did not have soft hands, brother. He was not willing to bite anybody else's sermons, and he stood tall that no one should listen to any gospel other than his. This man had confidence. We like that around here. Paul is a solid A tier. I don't think he has quite the resume to go up to S tier, but he is an A tier. Noah probably had to put up with more than anyone else on this list. Hey, we said we weren't counting Jesus. Noah had to put up with the Nephilim and with a whole bunch of stuff that they don't even mention in Scripture. All this is to say, I think Noah is a lot more Chad than we really get to see in the Bible. Just him standing tall for over 50 years building the ark, that took a lot of strength. Post-flood, Noah looks like he's been through some stuff. He has some PTSD or something. Don't really blame him. I mean, nobody else in history has ever had to deal with everyone outside of your own family dying. Noah doesn't have a big resume, but it would feel really weird leaving him off the list. So I think he's going to be in C tier. Realistically, Noah's probably higher than C tier, but from what we know in the Bible, he's a C. Abraham was cold. Abraham was cold. So remember the time when Abraham's little cousin Lot was in trouble and Abraham came to save him? The man brought 318 dudes, yeah, they were specific, it was exactly 318, to face off against multiple kings and multiple armies. And he smoked them. Now after that, the king of Sodom, who he saved, was like, hey, G, you can take the loot, thanks for the help. And then Abram, I forgot, he wasn't Abraham at the time, he was Abram, showed just how cold he was by refusing any of the loot, because he didn't want anyone to be able to say that they made him rich. 0 handouts around here, Abram was about it. Now Abram does have a weird mark in his book, not like a direct negative, but a weird one. The whole thing with pretending to be his wife's brother, I don't know. I mean, Scripture doesn't really condemn him about it, so I'm not going to condemn him about it, but it was weird. He was also willing to argue 5 rounds with God to save people in Sodom. He argued him all the way down from 50 righteous men down to 10. Not that many people are willing to argue against God and can also get what they want. Then when God told him to sacrifice his son Isaac's a little confused about the situation, so he says to his son, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering. I mean, that line is just cold. Abraham was a cold line factory. Abraham stood tall throughout his whole life. He gets to be an S tier. He's the father of basically all the S tiers. Did Abraham and Jacob, so we kind of have to do Isaac to get all the patriarchs. Jacob was a hard one to rate, but Isaac is straight up the odd man out. Jacob had major ups and major downs. But Isaac was basically the middle child. He just didn't have that much to do. I mean, Isaac did have to deal with almost getting sacrificed. That had to be crazy, and the Bible kind of just doesn't talk about his feelings about it, but, He did stack paper to the ceiling, which you got to give him props for. And we can't really take for granted that Isaac didn't mess everything up. From Moses' generation onward, it seemed like every other year Israel was finding a way to mess everything up. So Isaac holding it down is a point in his book. But he doesn't really have any feats. I mean, he did prefer Esau over Jacob, and Esau was a Giga Chad, so it kind of shows his values. And growing up under Abraham, I have to imagine that Isaac was a pretty tough guy. but he has to go in C tier because we don't know what he did. But like I said, feel kind of wrong to leave him off the list. All right, that's the list. Here's all the Chads in the Bible. There's like 50 other people you could put on here, but we don't got time for that today. If you agree, cool. If you don't, you're incorrect. See you later.